The sixth characteristic common to traditional diets has to do with the preparation of seeds, grains, nuts, legumes. All of these types of foods were consumed in these cultures, but only after a very careful period of preparation that involves soaking, sprouting, fermenting, or natural leavening, which is a type of fermentation process. And that's because seeds, like grains and legumes, contain inhibitors, blockers, and even compounds that are toxic to humans. So by these careful preparation processes, the enzyme inhibitors are deactivated. All seeds contain enzyme inhibitors. Now, we just learned about how important enzymes are. You want to have lots of enzymes in your diet, and you don't want to take 2 steps backwards by having a lot of inhibitors in your diet, because they will make digestion very difficult for you. Phytic acid is present in grains and legumes. This is a mineral blocker. It prevents the absorption of calcium, magnesium, copper, iron, and especially zinc. It's very difficult to get zinc out of these foods. In fact, it blocks the absorption of zinc. Tannins and lectins can be very irritating. The complex starches and sugars in these types of foods are very difficult to digest, and the gluten is not only difficult to digest, but for some people it's very toxic. And cellulose is impossible for humans to digest. So proper preparation makes these foods more digestible and their nutrients more available to humans. The herbivore, the animal that lives on grasses and seeds, has a complex digestive system that has from 2 to 4 stomachs, and at least one of these stomachs will act as a holding tank where fermentation takes place with special bacteria. The human stomach, although there are many variations, large and small, is a simple stomach, and we are simply not designed to digest these types of foods. We also have a very short intestinal tract compared to the herbivores. The gorilla, who is the same height as the man, has a lot more area for digestion than the human does. The human being actually has a relatively simple digestive tract. A lot of our disk space, so to speak, goes to the nervous system and not to the digestive tract. So we have to use our brains more or less to figure out how to pre-digest these types of food before we eat them. Basically, when we are doing this careful preparation, we are doing what happens in some of these stomachs of the herbivores. What happens in this careful preparation is that we are imitating nature. All of these inhibitors and phytic acid and so forth are equivalent to a plastic coating around the seed. They are the seed's preservatives. And that's what keeps the inside of the seed completely fresh until it's time to germinate and sprout. And then all of the nutrients are fresh and available to the plant. Well, you don't want to eat preservatives, not even natural preservatives. So when we are carefully preparing our food, we are actually neutralizing these preservatives and allowing the seed to sprout. And the 4 factors that make this possible are moisture, warmth, slight acidity, and time. And when these methods are used, they are employing these 4 factors. We'll come back later and look at some specific examples in cooking. But this is a photograph of a Cherokee woman, and she is preparing the typical Cherokee bread, which is made from a cooked cornmeal that's then wrapped in a corn leaf, a dried corn leaf. This is the original tamale, and it was then fermented for 2 weeks. It was put aside for 2 weeks, and only then did they eat the cornbread. They also then took the fermented cornmeal and mixed it with water to make a fermented beverage. In southern Mexico, they do the same thing, but they wrap the cornmeal in banana leaves. It's called pozole. It's put aside for 2 weeks, and the banana leaves become covered with green mold, sort of like blue cheese. And they eat the whole thing with the mold and everything, and it's considered a complete food. Since we are talking about grains and legumes, we need to address soy foods for a moment, because the soybean is a legume. And like all legumes, the soybean contains toxins. But the difference between the soybean and most legumes is that the soybean's toxins are very difficult to get rid of. They don't go away with just the typical type of soaking and cooking that you can use for other types of beans. In Asia, they never just boil up soybeans and eat them because they know that they're very toxic. Soybeans are very high in phytic acid, which is the blocker. It blocks the absorption of calcium, magnesium, iron, copper, and especially zinc. Best way to get zinc deficient in a real quick hurry is to eat a lot of soy. Soy also contains some very powerful enzyme inhibitors that block the digestion of protein. And when these are fed to animals, you get hypertrophy of the pancreas, an unnatural or pathogenic enlargement of the pancreas because the pancreas is working so hard, and this often can lead to pancreatic cancer. Unique to soy compared to other beans that we normally eat are the isoflavones. These are a type of estrogen-like compound in the soy. You can never get rid of this in normal processing, not fermentation or anything like that. And they are goitrogens. They block thyroid function. They cause depression of thyroid function and also endocrine disruption. These are estrogenic compounds. They will lower cholesterol. They are sterols that lower cholesterol, and that's why, of course, they can call soy a health food because it lowers cholesterol. But believe me, that's not something that you want to do. Cholesterol is your very best friend. Lectins can be irritating to the gastrointestinal tract. Manganese is an important nutrient, but you do not want to give manganese to growing children. Milk is low in manganese, especially for infants. You don't want to give them manganese. And we're very concerned about the soy infant formula with the high levels of manganese. Violent prisoners tend to have very high levels of manganese in their brains, and the symptoms of manganese poisoning are identical to the symptoms of autism. Inability to make emotional contact with the outside world. And oxalates are very high and can lead to kidney stones. So there's a whole cocktail of concerns here in the soy foods. And in Asia, what they do is ferment the soy foods for anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. And that gets rid of almost everything except the isoflavones. So they don't eat soy in large amounts, and they eat it in the context of a diet that's very supportive of thyroid health. The Japanese diet has very high levels of iodine and fish, and that's a very good diet for the thyroid gland. So they can eat a little bit of soy and not have problems with it. And I do want to distinguish between these traditional foods, which are mostly fermented or prepared in a way that gets rid of most of the toxins. They are consumed in small amounts in the context of a nutritious traditional diet, versus the modern soy foods, which are processed foods. They're added to a lot of familiar foods, like soy being added to hamburgers, soy is added to bread, and then all of these imitation foods. And then soy being consumed in inappropriate ways, like tofu cheesecake and tofu lasagna and so forth. And then, to make matters even worse, they've actually isolated these isoflavones and they're selling them as supplements, especially to women. I can't stress enough that soy foods are imitation foods. They are packaged and flavored and presented to look like the foods that they're replacing. And the industry would love for you to consume these foods rather than the real foods. There's a lot more profit on soy milk than there is on real milk. It's a myth that Asians consume a lot of soy. The average consumption in Japan is about 2 tablespoons a day. The staple of the Japanese diet is not soy, as you've often heard, but fish. 65% of calories come from fish. And in China, it's much less, just 2 teaspoons today, and the staple of that diet is pork. It's the number one meat consumed, and until recently, Chinese food was cooked in pork fat or duck fat. In animals, feeding soy in the diet has led to reproductive problems, infertility, thyroid disease, and liver disease in many species, mice, rats, quail, cheetahs, sturgeon, sheep, pigs, and monkeys. So why would not soy cause these same problems in humans? Promoters of soy say, well, these studies have no relevance to humans, but they obviously do have relevance to humans. We're not that different from these animals. So which are you going to drink, soy milk or real milk? The soy milk will have synthetic vitamin D, emulsifiers, lots of sweeteners because soy is very bitter. And 1 cup of soy milk contains 45 milligrams of isoflavones, which is twice the daily average of what you get in the Japanese diet. It's a toxic dose of phytoestrogens. And then although the processing to make soy milk does reduce the phytic acid and the enzyme inhibitors a little bit, they're still there. It's very difficult to digest soy milk. This is where our biggest concern is, the soy-based infant formula. It's just so inappropriate to be feeding babies something made out of beans. And a baby using soy infant formula gets a daily dose of estrogens 10 times greater as a function of body weight than the level found in Asian diets. And this is at a very vulnerable time of the growth of the infant. In little girls, it often leads to early development, breast development, and pubic hair before the age of 8, sometimes before the age of 3. We even got a letter from a mother who was eating a lot of soy and breastfeeding her baby, and the baby girl developed breasts while she was breastfeeding her. So pregnant women and nursing women should not be touching soy because these isoflavones do cross the placenta and they do get into the milk. Plus, they're getting all of these anti-nutrients and very high levels of manganese, aluminum, and fluoride. You just could not think of a worse way to start a baby off in life than with soy-based infant formula. A very good resource is The Whole Soy Story by Kayla Daniel, sold by New Trends Publishing. The Soy Alert section of the Weston A. Price Foundation has lists and lists of studies on the dangers of soy, and we have a nice Soy Alert flyer that you can pick up. That's a nice non-confrontational way of providing information to someone in the supermarket line who's got a market basket full of soy milk. You might want to just read this. Okay. Now we get into fats and oils. How much fat should we eat? How much fat should I eat? That's what people often ask me. And the answer is that depends. There's no one level that we find in traditional diets. There's a lot of variation. The Eskimos and some of the hunters, up to 80% of the calories in their diet was fat, mostly animal fat. Whereas in some of the African cultures, it was only about 30% of calories as fat. That was actually the minimum, which our government says should be the maximum. So there's a big variation. For my own metabolism, I'm a person who needs a lot of fat in the diet. I discovered that many of my health problems when I was growing up was due to hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. And when I figured out that if I ate a lot of fat with each meal, I no longer had hypoglycemia. Fats keep the blood sugar stable. So a high-fat diet works very well for me, but it might not work very well for somebody else, and other people do well on more carbohydrates. So, sorry I can't give you the definitive answer there. That's something that you're going to have to work out for yourself. But one thing that is pretty consistent across all of these diets is that only about 4% of calories comes from polyunsaturated fatty acids. So now I'm going to have to give you a little chemistry lesson, excuse me. But we need to look a little bit into the chemistry of fats and oils so you know what I mean when I say polyunsaturates, monounsaturates, and saturated fats. And don't worry, it's not hard. The chemistry of fats is very easy. Fats are just chains of carbon and mostly attached to hydrogen. And they range in length from 4 to 26 carbons. The one on the top row here is palmitic acid. That's 16 carbons long. And as you can see, every carbon is attached to 2 hydrogens as we go along. And there's an extra one at the end there. And so we say that this is fully saturated with hydrogen. And that's what a saturated fat is. It's where all of the links have hydrogen in them. We call the fat molecule a fatty acid, and that's a confusing term for people because when you think of an acid, you think of vinegar or lemon juice. But because of this carboxyl group on the end, it is technically an acid, but it does not behave like lemon juice or vinegar. So they're called fatty acids. That's the technical term for a fat molecule. So palmitic acid is a saturated fat, saturated fatty acid. And the next one is also fully saturated. This is a saturated fatty acid. And it's called stearic acid. It's 18 carbons long. And the nomenclature is very clever. There's a lot of 16 carbon saturate in palm oil. And as you can kind of guess, there's a lot of the stearic acid in beef. Think steers. Okay. All right. Now the next one, as you can see, is missing 2 hydrogens. It's not a saturated fat. It's not completely saturated. Instead, you have a double bond there. That's a much weaker bond than these hydrogen bonds. And this is called a monounsaturated fatty acid. It's got 1 double bond. And when they're unsaturated, they also have what's called an omega number, which you get from counting from the end. And if you count 9 carbons, you get to your double bond. And this fatty acid has the omega number of 9. It's oleic acid. It's found mostly, a lot of it's found in olive oil. And here's the way it's represented. 18 carbons, 1 double bond, and the omega number is 9. The saturated fats, that's 18 carbons, no double bonds. Okay. Now, your body needs a lot of saturated fat, and it also needs quite a bit of monounsaturated fat to function properly. Every cell in your body is surrounded by a membrane and a double layer of fatty acids, and there's billions of fatty acids in every cell of your body. And if most of those aren't saturated or monounsaturated, your cells will not work. So there's no guarantee that in your diet you're going to get enough saturated fat or monounsaturated fat, so your body makes those, knows how to make them. But the next 2, your body only needs in small amounts. It's almost every food you eat contains these 2 fatty acids, and so your body doesn't make them. And they're called essential fatty acids because you have to get them from your food. Once again, I don't like this word essential. In fact, I think the phrase essential fatty acid is extremely confusing phrase. What is this? An acid? Is it in water? You know. But it implies that these are not important. When you say, well, these are essential, you sort of think, well, these are not essential. But these are so essential, so important that your body makes them. Okay. The 2 so-called essential fatty acids that you have to get from food are both polyunsaturates, which means they have 2 or more double bonds. The first one is linoleic. It's 18 carbons long, got 2 double bonds. And if you count from the end, the first double bond is 6 carbons from the end, and that's an omega-6 fatty acid. I'm sure you've heard about omega-6 fatty acids. Now you know why they're called that. And the other one is linolenic acid. It has 3 double bonds, and the first double bond is 3 from the end. And so that's called an omega-3 fatty acid. That's your omega-3 fatty acid. So linolenic is 18 carbons, 3 double bonds, and the omega number is 3. So that's the famous omega-3 fatty acid that you've been hearing about. These are actually families of fatty acids, and we will come back to these in a moment, but arachidonic acid is one of the omega-6 family. There's a whole omega-3 family and a whole omega-6 family. Okay, here's another way of looking at these fatty acids. This is what a saturated fatty acid looks like. It's a straight molecule. They pack together easily, and that's why saturated fats tend to be solid at room temperature, because they form a crystalline structure. The oleic acid has a little bend there where the double bond is, and so it will be liquid at room temperature. But it's not that crooked, so when you chill them down, olive oil, if it's real olive oil, will be solid in the refrigerator. That's how you can tell if it's real olive oil, by the way. Okay. And here are our essential fatty acids, the linoleic and the linolenic. And you can see these are very kinky molecules. Every time you have a double bond, you have a little twist there. And so these are liquid even in the refrigerator, and it has to do with the shape of these molecules. But the important thing to understand is that a saturated fat and a monounsaturated fat, these are stable. They don't break down. They last a long time. They're safe to eat. You can cook with them. You can heat them. You can even expose them to air, and they're stable. And they don't become dangerous. Whereas the polyunsaturates are fragile. Every time you have a hydrogen sticking out here at these funny angles, it is prone to being broken off if it's heated or exposed to oxygen, as in processing or cooking. You never want to cook with these liquid oils because they break down in cooking and they form what? Free radicals. Free radicals are when you have a missing electron here, a missing hydrogen, and the unpaired electron creates uncontrolled reactions in the body. We've been told that cholesterol and saturated fat are our enemy, and that is sending us down the wrong path. One of the real problems in the diet is free radicals in these processed polyunsaturated oils. Here is a healthy artery, and there's some fat here around this artery, and this is in the heart, and that's saturated fat. That's what your heart wants to be healthy. This is an unhealthy artery. You can see that it's sort of scarred, and there's not good color to it, not good blood to it. And this is what free radicals do. They're like little knives going around and causing damage, causing ruptures, creating, irritations. So just next time you reach for the Wesson oil, remember what these arteries look like. The saturated and monounsaturated fats are stable and they don't react. They're not creating uncontrolled reactions in your arteries. They're also the shorter chain fatty acids. These range in length from 4 to 14 carbons. They're always saturated. They're found in small amounts in butter and large amounts in coconut oil. A triglyceride, by the way, is just 3 fatty acids joined to a glycerol molecule. This is how fats occur in nature, in threes as triglycerides. Your body, you take in the triglycerides during digestion. They're broken down into what they call free fatty acids. They're absorbed across the gut wall, and then they're reconfigured as triglycerides. And when you hear this word triglycerides, that just means fatty acids in your blood. Well, we have been made to be deathly afraid of saturated fat, blamed for everything from clogging arteries to making us fat. There's a whole book on multiple sclerosis that blames saturated fats. There's a book on the skin that blames saturated fat. Every evil in our modern society seems to be blamed on saturated fats. And you know what? None of it is true. It is just completely unscientific to finger the saturated fats as the culprit for our modern diseases. We know a lot about saturated fats. First of all, at least 50% of your cell membranes must be saturated or your cells will not function properly. They will not work. You need saturated fats to put calcium in the bones. Believe it or not, saturated fats are good for your heart. They actually lower a marker for heart disease called lipoprotein little a. By the way, your cholesterol reading is not a good marker for whether or not you're prone to heart disease. People with low cholesterol get heart attacks just as much as people with high cholesterol. But lipoprotein little a is a very accurate marker, and saturated fats do lower it. And saturated fats are the preferred food for the heart. That's why in all mammals, humans and mammals that are vegetarian like cows, the heart is surrounded by very solid fat because that's what the heart wants. Nature isn't making a mistake here. Saturated fats protect the liver from alcohol and other poisons. The lungs function with something called surfactant. Surfactant is makes like a little soap bubble that allows the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide in 2 directions. And that surfactant is made up of 2 saturated fatty acids. Your lungs cannot function without saturated fats. And this is why children who get butter and whole milk when they're growing have much less asthma than children given skim milk and margarine. The kidneys also work with saturated fats. The immune system is enhanced by saturated fats. And the essential fatty acids actually cannot function in your body without saturated fats. They work together. As so many other systems in the body, there's a synergy there. And finally, saturated fats support the body's detoxification mechanisms. There are many, many important roles. And then the shorter chain, the short and medium chain saturated fatty acids that we get in coconut oil and butter have some very interesting properties. First of all, they raise the body temperature and they give you quick energy. They're never stored as fat, so this makes them ideal for weight loss, for people with slow metabolisms. They boost the metabolism. They support the immune system, and they work in intercellular communication, and this is why we strongly recommend that any cancer patient get on the coconut oil. It's really very helpful for cancer patients. And finally, they are antimicrobial. The short-chain fatty acids kill the bad guys in the intestinal tract. They kill pathogens, including Candida. And of course, the latest thing is the antibiotic-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Antibiotic-resistant staph, which is a huge problem. And everybody's buying wipes and wiping off the doorknobs and all this. Mary Enig and her colleagues have recently published research showing that the strongest antimicrobial substance for this type of staph is coconut oil, is the lauric acid in coconut oil. The school children can no longer get whole milk. It's considered a junk food. They are being starved for the fats they need for growth on the premise that whole milk is going to make them fat. This is completely unscientific. We have a new study out of Sweden where they showed that children on low-fat diets got fatter, consumed more sugar, and had higher insulin resistance than children on normal diets. Another recent study, women drinking low-fat milk had fertility problems. Some of them could get pregnant after they went on whole milk. And then the doctor said, as soon as you get pregnant, you go back to skim milk. That's what's being said. No one has looked at what happens to little girls who are on low-fat milk from infancy, whether you can reverse the infertility that's going to occur if we are feeding our children low-fat milk. And in another study of Swedish women, those using full-fat dairy and cheese had lower weight gain as they grew older. By the way, ladies, it is normal to gain weight as you get older. If you're still wearing your prom dress when you're 50 years old, you're too thin. Probably living in the past also. If you don't gain a little weight when you go through menopause, you're probably too frail. 2 dress sizes is what I like to say, but of course you don't want to gain any more than that. So here's a diagram of the cell membrane. These are phospholipids. Every one of these little lines here is a fatty acid, and they need to be straight, mostly straight, to pack together like logs so the cell membrane has integrity and the proper stiffness. The polyunsaturated fatty acids tend to be near the carrier proteins, and they have a function to play there as well. But most of the fatty acids need to be saturated or monounsaturated. There's a dietary theory out there now that is called the Paleolithic diet, which does admit that human beings used to eat a lot of animal foods in our caveman days, but we certainly didn't eat those terrible saturated fats. And the books on the Paleolithic diet are high in meat, but recommend canola oil and flax oil and cut all the fat off the meat and all the skin off the chicken. Well, this is a cave painting, and these look like dairy animals to me. And the dairying goes back about 30,000 years, maybe even longer. And certainly people who had herds had plenty of saturated fat. In fact, the older dairy animals, their milk was much richer in fat than the modern dairy animal. First dairy animal was the goat, and goat milk is higher in fat and higher in saturated fat than cow's milk. The hunter-gatherer, as we pointed out, hunted animals selectively. They never ate lean meat. They always saved the fat. People in the tropics, where they were eating a lot of fish, which has a lot of polyunsaturates, nevertheless had coconut oil. And there's one other source of saturated fat, and that's carbohydrates. Your body is a very good converter of carbohydrates into saturated fat. And you think of something like the Japanese diet, where they eat rice. It's a very important part of that diet because that's their source of saturated fat. And if you cut out the rice and are only eating the fish without the types of dairy fats that we have in the West, you can really get in trouble in that diet. So when we look at all these traditional diets, we shouldn't discount the various components of the diet because they all work together in that particular diet. Well, don't these saturated fats give us heart disease and raise our cholesterol? That's what the industry wants you to believe, but in many of the very important studies, they actually found the opposite. One of these was the Framingham study. And in 1992, the director admitted in a very obscure medical journal that in Framingham, they found that the more saturated fat people ate, the more cholesterol they ate, the more calories they ate, the lower people's serum cholesterol. We found that the people who ate the most cholesterol, the most saturated fat, and the most calories weighed the least and were the most physically active. So 3 of the most important so-called risk factors, cholesterol, physical activity, and weight, was proportional to the saturated fat in the diet. Then we hear this phrase, artery clogging saturated fat. Well, they looked at the artery clogs. This was in 1994, published in The Lancet. This was an analysis of the types of fats in the plaque, the artery clogs. Only about 26% was saturated. Then there was monounsaturated and quite a bit of polyunsaturated. So why are they picking out the saturated fat? Why don't they blame the unsaturated fats? There's a lot more of those. By the way, most of the artery clogs is not even fat. It is calcium. It's like lime building up in the pipes. This is quite interesting here. This is the adipose tissue. Now that's that part of you that makes it hard to put that pair of pants on this season that you couldn't wear last season. Notice how much monounsaturated is in the adipose tissue. That's what builds up in the fat of our fat cells when we are gaining weight. And this is why, unlike most diet books, we do not recommend a lot of olive oil if you're trying to lose weight. And this is one of my favorite studies, 1965. This was a diet study. There's very few diet studies, actually, when they're looking at heart disease. But these were high-risk patients who'd already had a heart attack. They were divided into 3 groups. One group was put on polyunsaturated corn oil. The second group was given monounsaturated olive oil. And the third group was told to consume saturated animal fats. After 2 years, the corn oil group was doing really well, 30% lower cholesterol. But only 52% of them were still alive. The olive oil group didn't do much better, 57% alive after 2 years. The best outcome was the animal fat group, 75% alive after 2 years, and these were people who had already had heart attacks. And this is looking at some epidemiological data from Europe. These are the countries with the lowest saturated fat consumption. They have fairly high, and this one has a very high rate of heart disease. These are the countries with the highest saturated fat consumption. They have the lowest rates of heart disease. This is called the French paradox here, but there's also a Swiss paradox, a Dutch paradox. All of these paradoxes, you know, when you have a theory with so many paradoxes in it, there's something wrong with your theory. Now, every fat and oil that we consume is actually a combination of fatty acids. There's not just one type of fatty acid. And each fat and oil is characterized by the predominant fatty acids. So these are the high oleic oils, the predominantly monounsaturated oils. This is olive oil, lots of oleic acid, and a little bit of saturated. So it's going to be very stable. Almost 90% of the fatty acids in olive oil are stable. And it has a little bit of omega-6 and a little bit of omega-3. Peanut oil is not going to be as good a choice for you as olive oil. And then there's the sesame oil. Sesame oil has a lot of omega-6, but there's something unique about sesame oil. It has very rich in antioxidants that are activated on heating, on cooking. So this was actually used and is pretty safe if it's truly cold pressed and not processed. Sesame oil is a traditional oil. Okay, let's look at the animal fats. This is tallow. Tallow is fat from a ruminant, like a lamb or beef. And the ruminant is designed to create saturated fats. That's what happens in the ruminant. The fats have hydrogen added to them. And so tallow is very rich in saturated fat. And then there's also quite a bit of monounsaturated fat. So you can see that this is a very stable fat. This is the preferred fat for deep frying when you're heating an oil very hot. And this is what they used to use for the McDonald's fries and for all the fast food fries. There's a little bit of omega-6 and a little bit of omega-3. Beef fat is a nice source of essential fatty acids in just the right proportions and just the right amount. And all of this saturated fat helps you to use the essential fatty acids very efficiently. This is lard. Lard is fat from a pig. Pig is a monogastric animal, just one stomach, lot like a human. And it's 40% saturated and then quite a bit of mono. So this will be a little bit softer at room temperature than tallow will be. Still an excellent fat for cooking, very stable. And it has about 10% omega-6 in it. And here is butter. Butter has a unique fatty acid profile. About 11% of the fatty acids are these wonderful short and medium chain fatty acids that support the immune system and kill pathogens in the gut and boost the metabolism. And then you have the saturated, normal saturated fats, the monounsaturated. So you can see once again that butter is very stable, fine for cooking. You can heat it and it doesn't become damaged. And then a beautiful amount, just about 4%. Of omega-6 and omega-3 in a nice balance. And these are the tropical oils. We'll start over here. This is palm oil. Remember we saw the jar of palm oil this morning. Palm oil is very saturated. And then there's a lot of monounsaturated. It's very stable. You can use it for cooking. This is what they're using in Europe for processed foods because they're totally getting rid of the trans fats in Europe. The palm oil comes from a fruit that looks like a date or an olive, a very oily fruit. And then the kernel, you can also get oil out of the kernel, and that has a lot of short and medium chain fatty acids. This is a very expensive oil. It's used for specialty candies and chocolates and things like that. And this is the coconut oil. This is the one that's we have very prevalent and wonderful oil to use. Very saturated, over 90% saturated, of which over 60% are the short and medium chain saturated fatty acids that are so protective, so good for the cancer patient. And then a little bit of mono and a little bit of omega-6. So just to summarize here, in the modern diet, we've got something we've never had before. About 20% of calories are coming from polyunsaturated fatty acids, and this situation is unique in the history of mankind. We've never had anything like this before. In the primitive diet, about 4% of calories come from essential fatty acids. So where are all these coming from? They're coming from the salad oils and the cooking oils that are extracted from corn, cottonseed, sunflower, safflower, and soybean. And basically, they're very high in omega-6, and these oils go through a process called winterization, where they actually take out the saturated and the monounsaturated fats. So they're almost pure omega-6, these oils. Here is an industrial flow chart of how these oils are produced. They're produced in factories that use the very same type of equipment that's used in oil refineries. And the oils are extracted with a very high temperature process. They go through a caustic refining, a pre-bleach, Some of them get hydrogenated post-bleach. They're winterized, fractionated, they're blended, and they're deodorized, which is another very high-temperature process. And then they get packaged, and they put a little bit of yellow color in them so it reminds you of butter. They smell, they have no smell, and yet they are absolutely rancid. They are loaded with free radicals. They're completely toxic. And then they tell you to cook with them, that these are the heart-healthy oils for cooking. And I just want to remind you again of that crusty artery. We have Krusty the Clown here. These oils make you age. Free radicals cause wrinkles and premature aging. They cause cancer and heart disease. They disrupt the immune system. They disrupt the production of prostaglandins. They damage the liver. They depress learning ability. They're particularly damaging to the reproductive organs and the lungs, the sites where we have the most cancer in the Western world. Reproductive organs and the lungs. And there's a lot of people getting lung cancer who've never smoked, but they're using these oils. They cause digestive disorders, and we're concerned about their effect on growing children. They cause impaired growth because they lower cholesterol, and children need as much cholesterol as they can get during the growth period. You do not need to be buying these oils to get your essential fatty acids. They're in all of the foods that you eat, and when they're in the foods, they are protected from damage, pretty much. It's when you extract these that they start to cause problems. So grains, nuts, animal fats, vegetables, legumes, fish, eggs, and fruits. They all contain essential fatty acids in small amounts, and that's exactly the way your body needs them. Now, the eighth underlying characteristic of a healthy traditional diet is a concept that I am sure you have heard about, and that has to do with the balance of omega-6 and omega-3. How many of you have heard about this? This is really out there, this concept. Gotten a lot of play in the media. Interestingly enough, the first popular book that talked about the balance of omega-3 and omega-6 was a cookbook called Nourishing Traditions. So here we have the primitive diet with about 4% of calories from polyunsaturated oils with a ratio of about 2.5 to 1.5. Now, if it's 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, your body can deal with a certain amount of variance here, but your body cannot deal with this, with 20 to 1. And that's what we're seeing in the modern diet. Your body wants fairly equal amounts of omega-6 and omega-3. And one of the reasons that we are having problems today is because of a change in agriculture. When you put your chickens inside and feed them, corn and they're not getting out in the sunlight and green grass and eating bugs, you're going to get this, 20 to 1, omega-6 to omega-3. Whereas your free-range eggs, you're going to have a nice balance. Same with salmon. Wild salmon looks like this, whereas farm-raised salmon looks like this. Spinach. Organic spinach will look like this, but industrially raised spinach will be more of the omega-6. So when you go to industrial agriculture, the omega-3 starts to disappear, and you get a lot more omega-6. This is not, however, the case with the ruminant animals. With your chickens, yes, you'll get this change. With salmon, yes, but not with the ruminant animals, and that's a big misconception. You hear a lot about eating grass-fed beef because it's going to be much higher in omega-3 and lower in saturated fats, and so it must be good for you. Well, this chart shows a difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef. And the total fat goes up in the grain-fed beef. The saturated fat is the same. The increase comes from the increase in monounsaturated fat. When animals get fat and when humans get fat, that increase is in monounsaturates. There are some slight changes in the essential fatty acids. You get a slight increase in omega-6, and when you go to grain feeding, and a very slight decrease in omega-3. But you know what? This is less than 1% of the total to start with. So it's no big deal. The ratio goes from 1 to 3 to 1 to 6. So I think we're really misguided in promoting grass-fed beef because of the omega-3, because this is not what happens with the ruminants. The reason we like grass-fed beef is because there's more fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamins A, D, E, and K, they're in the fat. There's more of something called CLA, which is an anti-cancer compound, weight loss compound. That's in the fat. There's more minerals in grass-fed beef, and they're mostly in the fat. There's minerals in the membranes of the fat. So to get the benefits of grass feeding, you've got to eat the fat, you know. And yet we're being, grass-fed beef is promoted because it's lean, and even if it does get fat, they often cut the fat off because they think people don't want it. It's my favorite verse from the Bible. And I will send grass in thy fields for thy cattle, that thou mayest eat and be satisfied. You'll feel satisfied. Your requirements for nutrients will be satisfied. And they'll only be satisfied, however, if you're eating the fat. Once more, we see the wisdom of the primitive cultures in eating the fats from these animals. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit technical here for the health professionals and practitioners in the audience. You do have this chart in your notebook. Remember, I talked about families, the omega-6 family and the omega-3 family. And these families occur when you take the original fatty acid, the omega-6 linoleic and the omega-3 linolenic, and through enzymes, you make them longer and more unsaturated. So in the body, you start putting more double bonds in and adding carbons, and they get longer and more unsaturated. So the longest one here is 22 carbons and has 5 double bonds, but it's still in the omega-6 family. And then over here on the omega-3 family, they get longer and more unsaturated. The ones that you've probably heard most about are arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6, and EPA and DHA, which are omega-3 fatty acids. And these are important because your body makes prostaglandins out of them. Prostaglandins are hormones in your tissues. They are not hormones that are running around in your bloodstream, but they're hormones in your tissues. And they direct all sorts of things. They direct healing. They direct blood clotting. They direct inflammation. They direct all sorts of processes in the cells. The Series 1 prostaglandins are made from something called DGLA. The Series 2 prostaglandins are made from arachidonic acid, and that's how arachidonic acid has been demonized, because they say, well, these prostaglandins cause inflammation. What they don't tell you is that these prostaglandins also are anti-inflammatory. So there's nothing particularly wrong with arachidonic acid. The reason the gurus don't like arachidonic acid is because it's found in animal fats. It's also found in your brain. 11% of your brain is arachidonic acid. I call this I call this the fast lane. If you've injured yourself, you need quick action. If you need blood clotting, inflammation, healing, boy, the omega-6 pathway gets to work. Also, the omega-6 pathway has to do with growth, and mother's milk is actually quite a bit higher in omega-6 than omega-3 for a reason, because babies need it for growth. This is a slow lane over here, and this has to do with anti-inflammatory, with anti-clotting, with long-term effects, as opposed to the short-term effects. And the short-term effects are very important. If you didn't clot and if you didn't have inflammation, you couldn't deal with injury. So the important point is that humans don't do this very well, and many people need to actually eat these foods to get these elongated fatty acids. And those of you who are working with patients will often see problems with deficiencies in these elongated, super unsaturated fatty acids. Here are some of the conditions that make it difficult to make these fatty acids. Malnutrition. Diabetics really have trouble making these elongated, so they need to get them from their food. Trans fats or too much omega-6, too much sugar, endocrine problems, and various deficiencies. And these pathways shut down. So going back to look at them again, any of these problems, you're going to need to actually get them from the food. And once again, these are the sacred foods. And this is why we need the balance. If you're getting a lot of omega-6 and not enough omega-3, this pathway just shuts down. And by the same token, if you're overdosing on flax oil and getting too much omega-3, this pathway will shut down. And you might find that it's hard to have your blood clot, or that you don't, your body doesn't respond appropriately when you're injured. And these are some of the conditions that you'll see when this enzyme is defective. That's the first enzyme here. A lot of diabetics don't have this enzyme working. So these are some of the conditions that you'll see: diabetes, alcoholism. Interesting, isn't it? Cancer, premature aging, high cholesterol, which is not a disease, just a marker. So a lot of conditions will emerge when these pathways aren't working. This enzyme is very critical, the delta-6 desaturase. That's the first enzyme in these pathways. A lot of people don't have this enzyme, genetically don't have it. If your ancestors came from seacoast regions or Native American, where they ate a lot of organ meats, where they had a lot of these ready-made in the diet, your body doesn't need to have this enzyme, doesn't make it. So genetically you won't have this enzyme. And that's why in certain populations we see, for example, more alcoholism, because they don't have the delta-6 desaturase. The Irish, Native Americans, they really need to have the food sources for these. So what are the food sources? In the omega-6 family, the first step is called gamma-linoleic acid. Evening primrose, borage, and blackcurrant oils. These can be very useful for diabetics. The DGLA, which is made into the series 1 prostaglandins, liver and other organ meats, and the arachidonic acid, the animal fats, egg yolks, organ meats, brain. And then in the omega-3s, you have the EPA, which we get from fish liver oils and fish eggs, and the DHA, which is very important for neurological function. That comes from the animal fats and the organ meats. So once again, the sacred foods. The same foods that give us vitamins A, D, and K are going to give us these very important special types of fatty acids. The 9th underlying characteristic, all of the diets, this is a surprising one, all of the diets contain salt, another very important food that's been demonized. They either use sea salt or they got salt from salt flats or mines. In parts of Africa where they had no access to salt, they burnt sodium-rich marsh grasses and added them to their food. Milk and meat products naturally concentrate salt, and in some cultures they consume the blood and urine of their animals in order to get salt. Salt is a great enzyme activator, and you need more salt with cooked foods. Why do we need salt? Why do we have a salt taste in our mouth? It was not put there to torture us. It's because we need salt. We need salt for protein digestion. The chloride component of salt is what your body uses for the production of hydrochloric acid. So you need salt for protein digestion. And salt activates enzymes needed for carbohydrate digestion. So salt is critical for digestion. Salt is very important for the development of the brain in the infants. Sodium activates enzymes that are used to make glial cells in the brain. These are the cells that make us capable of higher thinking, creative thinking. Salt is critical for adrenal function, for dealing with stress, and it is the basis of cellular metabolism. We couldn't have the body chemistry without salt. So nature, in her wisdom, puts a salt taste in our mouth, makes food taste better with salt because we're supposed to eat salt. The problem comes in with modern processing. Traditional salt was made by the evaporation of seawater, so it provided not only sodium chloride but every trace mineral in the sea. This is particularly important today with our depleted soils. In modern salt, they've taken out all the magnesium, all the trace minerals, and they use an aluminum-based additive so it pours when it rains. Okay? So it doesn't stick together. We recommend unrefined salt. Your salt should be gray, pink, or beige, not white. The color indicates the presence of minerals. And it's very interesting. We have a doctor on our board of directors, Dr. Tom Cowan, who treats a lot of cases of high blood pressure with just one prescription, and that is only use unrefined salt. That has a twofold effect. First of all, they get a lot more magnesium in their diet, and secondly, they end up not eating any processed foods because processed foods are all made with refined salt. And that, he said, in 90% of all cases, that takes care of the high blood pressure. The 10th underlying characteristic was that all traditional cultures made use of bones, usually as a nourishing bone broth. They cooked the bones to make broth. And there's many important benefits from bone broth. First of all, it supplies calcium and other minerals in a form that the body can easily assimilate. All the minerals you need for healthy bones. Secondly, it supplies nutrients that help build healthy cartilage. The amino acids in broth have an amazing detoxifying effect. This is why the good, rich chicken broth is so good when people are sick, because it helps you detoxify. It nourishes and detoxifies at the same time. And finally, broth is a wonderful source of gelatin, and gelatin is a great aid to digestion. Raw foods are hydrophilic. That means they attract liquids, including digestive juices. You know what happens when you put a bean in water or even a carrot in water. They swell up a little bit because they're hydrophilic. When you cook foods, they become hydrophobic. They repel liquids, including your digestive juices. But gelatin, as you know, is hydrophilic. You know what happens when you add water to Jell-O. It absorbs all of that liquid. And so when you're eating a meal of cooked foods, but including a gelatin-rich broth or sauce or gravy, that makes it hydrophilic and attracts the digestive juices, and they get thoroughly mixed in with your food, and you have much easier digestion. And a lot of work was done on gelatin up until about the 1950s, when the industry realized they couldn't make any money off of gelatin. Very useful in the treatment of malnutrition, digestive disorders. It was used to treat tuberculosis and diabetes. Very, very useful. It's the good old Jewish penicillin, the wonderful gelatin-rich chicken soup. Anyone here ever get tired? Not have enough energy to do all the things that you want to do? The solution to fatigue is easy digestion. The easier your foods are to digest, the more energy that you'll have left over, because digestion takes a lot of energy from your body. So raw dairy, not pasteurized, easy to digest. The proper preparation of grains, which pre-digest your grains. The lacto-fermented foods, which provide enzymes and bacteria for digestion. And the gelatin-rich bone broths. That's the magic formula for having more energy. Less energy required for digestion, the more energy that you will have. Finally, traditional cultures made provisions for future generations. They fed special foods for parents-to-be, pregnant women, nursing women, and growing children. These were the sacred foods. They understood the principle of providing the maximum nutrition when the baby's being formed and growing. You can't go back after the house is built and rebuild it. You have to provide these nutrient-dense foods while growth is occurring. Another fascinating thing that Dr. Price described in his book was the spacing of children. In many of these cultures, particularly throughout the South Seas and Africa, it was considered shameful to have a child more than once every 3 years. And if you were having your children too close together, you were really on the outs in your village, and you don't want that to happen when you live in a village. They had many ways of doing this. Some cultures had herbs that provided natural birth control. Some of the cultures had herbs that provided birth control for up to 7 years. Some cultures, especially in Africa, were polygamous, and when one of the wives had a young child up to the age of 2, she wore a special necklace which said, "I am not available." And her husband had relations with his other wives. And in some cultures, they actually practice abstinence from the 6th month of pregnancy until the child reached 2 years of age. The husband and wife had no relations so that she would not get pregnant. Tremendous amount of wisdom and love in this practice to make sure that all the children have the same nutrition, start out with the same deck of cards, and that the mother does not become exhausted with too frequent pregnancies. And finally, they taught the principles of proper diet to the young. This really puts us to shame. We are not doing this today. It's considered really cool for high school girls to be vegetarians or vegans, and they basically end up living on soy and sugar. This is not a disaster in the making. This is a disaster that's already here. And it's almost like a religion for these young people. That's why we're so happy to see so many young people here soaking up the information we have to offer. This woman from Fiji has walked many miles to obtain a special food for the baby growing in her womb. It's a sacred food, a type of crab, and she will eat the whole animal, the roe, the organ meats, the flesh, and also she will use the shell to get the calcium. Going back to our American beauty, her sister, born 15 months later, she's still a lovely girl, but you can see there is not the good facial structure in the middle third of the face, a little bit of crowding in the teeth. And this was the pattern that we saw before the Second World War. The older children in a family had the good bone structure, and then with each child coming down the line, you had a narrower face. Now, if they were on a dairy farm, very often you would get 4 or 5 children in a row with good bone structure, until finally the mother was just too exhausted. And then you got the narrow face. And very often the last children in a family of 10 or 12, you'd have a retarded child or a child with a birth defect. The Kennedy family is a good example. The older 10 children in a row with hardly any space in between. The older boys tended to have naturally straight teeth, and you got the overbite or the crowded teeth with the younger boys. These are the 3rd and 4th children in a modern family. They were not locked in a closet. They were allowed to have friends and go to friends' houses, but they were very well protected with a very nutrient-dense diet at home. Cod liver oil, egg yolks, plenty of good nutrient-dense foods, and they were spaced 3 years apart. So this is possible in our modern world. We've learned these fundamental characteristics of traditional diets. Now what do we do? How do we apply these in our own lives? So what I'd like to do now is go through 11 ways of changing your diet for the better, practical steps you can take. I know it often seems overwhelming, especially if you're a newcomer to our information. The first one is really easy. Make your own salad dressing. Salad dressing is easy to make. The ingredients for basic salad dressing start with a good quality olive oil, cold pressed olive oil, a little bit of flax oil, and we'll tell you why in a moment. Good vinegar, preferably a raw vinegar. Can be wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, rice vinegar, balsamic vinegar, and a good quality mustard. All you do is dip your fork in the mustard and then add a little bit of vinegar, stirring around, and then very slowly you add the olive oil, stirring all while you're adding it, and that will make an emulsion. You'll have a nice thick dressing without any additives or emulsifiers. And then we're going to add the flax oil. Now, this young man has nice straight teeth here, and very often have people say to me, "I know all about fats and oils. I use flax oil." Well, this young man does not have straight teeth because he used flax oil. There's no fat-soluble activators in flax oil. He has straight teeth because he got cod liver oil, not flax oil. The reason we use flax oil is because it provides us with a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. It's a very rich source, and we add just a little bit of flax oil to the salad dressing. And I do want to stress that you're only going to add a little bit because we don't want to overdose on omega-3s, just like we don't want to overdose on omega-6s. So we're making our own salad dressing rather than buying the commercial dressings. And once again, I want this picture of the bad artery to be indelibly fixed in your minds. And I want you to associate it with these vegetable oils because it's the free radicals and all the dangerous breakdown products in these oils that results in the damage to your arteries. So I did a comparison. Here's our homemade dressing on this side. We've used extra virgin olive oil, which is a source of stable oleic acid, rich in vitamin E and antioxidants. And there's another benefit from olive oil. It's a good source of vanadium, which is very helpful to the heart, good for the cardiovascular system. And then we have a little bit of omega-3 in our flaxseed oil, and that also contains vitamin E and antioxidants. So we have a very stable and nice combination of fatty acids here. Whereas if you're using commercial salad dressings, they're made with the cheapest oils, processed oils that that are out there. It's mostly rancid omega-6. There are always some trans fats in them, even if they're not on the label. And free radicals, polymers, all sorts of things you do not want to put in your body. They're loaded with preservatives, additives, and flavorings. You couldn't think of a more toxic brew. And this is why the government wants you to eat lettuce, of course. So you'll use these salad dressings on your lettuce. And the cost is about the same. This was the surprising thing. The average cost of the commercial dressing is about $1.50 a cup. And in using the finest ingredients, you can make this basic salad dressing for the same price, $1.50 a cup. Now, this is your basic dressing. You may want to add garlic, herbs. You might want to add some egg yolks. Throw it in the blender with some cream and blue cheese, and you have blue cheese dressing. So there's all sorts of things you can do to add to your basic dressing. We talked earlier about this omega-6, omega-3 imbalance. It's very easy to eliminate the imbalance. First of all, just get rid of all the commercial vegetable oils in your diet. Use a small amount of flax oil for your omega-3s, and I want to stress small, half a teaspoon a day, maximum. I once had a woman come up to me and said, I don't know how I'm going to get the 3 tablespoons of flax oil into my baby. There's some unscrupulous oil salesmen out there who are promoting flax oil and these omega-3 fatty acids, and it's just overdoing, and you can get into a lot of problems with too much omega-3s, especially for growing children. And then choose organic and pasture-fed animal and plant foods for a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. Well, the last oil to talk about is canola oil. The industry developed canola oil because they thought it would be very heart healthy. It's high in monounsaturates, very low in saturates, and as an added bonus, has a lot of omega-3 in it. They thought this is going to be the perfect oil to use in all our processed foods because it's good for the heart. But when they did animal studies on the canola oil, they found that it was not heart healthy. It greatly increased the need for vitamin E. It caused heart lesions in test animals, increased platelet clumping, and caused death in stroke-prone rats. So it was not at all heart healthy, but they went ahead with the canola oil anyway. And this is what they're using in the restaurants. My husband took this photograph outside a Chinese restaurant in Toronto. All these empty containers of canola oil. By the way, the canola oil has to be deodorized because of the omega-3 fatty acids, and that creates trans fats, and the remaining omega-3 fatty acids are very rancid. So you don't want to be using canola oil. So the first one is easy, and the second one is easy too. Switch to butter. Avoid partially hydrogenated oils. So we need a little bit more on our fats and oils lessons. We need to talk about this process called partial hydrogenation, which creates trans fats. So what are trans fats? First of all, let's look at how margarine and shortenings are made, or this process called partial hydrogenation. You start with the cheapest oils. They're extracted at very high temperature and pressure. The remaining fraction of the oils is removed with hexane. Hexane is a very carcinogenic solvent. Hexane is gasoline, food-grade gasoline. Okay. Then the oils, which are already rancid, are steam cleaned. That gets rid of all the vitamins and antioxidants, but the pesticides and solvents are still there. The oil is then mixed with a nickel catalyst. It's put into a big reactor, and in the reactor, under very high temperature and high pressure, and the presence of this catalyst, the molecular structure of the fatty acids is actually changed. The hydrogen is rearranged in the fatty acids. What goes into this reactor is a liquid oil. What comes out is a semi-solid. Actually, what comes out looks like gray cottage cheese, and it smells horrible. Then they mix in emulsifiers to get rid of the lumps. They steam clean it to get rid of the horrible odor, and then they bleach it to get rid of the gray color. At this point, what you have is called pure vegetable shortening. Doesn't that sound nice? Then they add, to make margarine, they add artificial flavors and synthetic vitamins, but they are not allowed to add artificial color to margarine. They have to add a natural color to margarine. Isn't that comforting? Then it's packaged in blocks and tubs and promoted as a health food. If you saw how this was being made, and you never will because there's no films of this. They don't take pictures inside these processing plants. And this is how they take a liquid oil and make it into a solid fat that behaves like a saturated fat, so they can use it in frying, and they can use it as shortening in cakes and cookies and things like that. Okay, so what happens when they do this process called partial hydrogenation? This is what a saturated fat looks like, saturated fatty acid. It's straight, packs together, so it's solid at room temperature, and it's fully saturated. And you'll notice that the hydrogens are in pairs on each of the carbons, and that's what you want in your cell membranes. When you have this pair, you have both stability and reactivity. So the remaining two hydrogens are on the same side, and they create an electron cloud. So that's stable and also reactive, and that's called the cis configuration. During the process of partial hydrogenation, one of these is moved to the other side. It's moved across, and trans means across. So that's your trans fatty acid, and that causes the molecule to straighten out and behave like a saturated fat, but it is not a saturated fat. You don't have that electron cloud here, a place where reactions can be made. And in some of these trans fats, you'll have 3 or 4 places like this. Now, when you eat trans fats, your body doesn't recognize them as being foreign. They are absorbed, they're assimilated in the body, and they're built into your cell membranes. And so what you end up with is a cell membrane full of trans fats. And what happens is that when your body wants to make a reaction right here, and the omega-9 position or whatever position it is, instead of having a nice electron cloud where it can make that reaction, there's a dead spot, and the reaction cannot take place. So the more trans fats you eat, the more they're built into your cell membranes, and the more chaos you're going to have on the cellular level, because your body cannot make the reactions it's trying to make. And suddenly receptors don't work, enzymes don't work, all sorts of processes are not going to work. Your cells can't get rid of things, it can't bring things in because of all of these dead spots in the trans fats. And we know from numerous studies that these hydrogenated trans fats contribute to heart disease and cancer. They contribute to degeneration of the joints and tendons. This is why so many people need hip replacements. They cause osteoporosis. They are the cause of type 2 diabetes, make no mistake. Type 2 diabetes is a situation where the receptors for insulin do not work. You've got sugar and insulin in your bloodstream, and the inside of your cells are starving because the sugar cannot get in there. Autoimmune diseases, skin problems, hormonal problems. We saw that the trans fats interfere with the production of sex hormones and stress hormones. And then we look at what these things do to growing children. They interfere with growth, they interfere with learning, they contribute to low birth weight, and even a very small amount of trans fats in a nursing mother's diet or a pregnant woman's diet will result in lowered visual acuity for the baby, interferes with formation of the eye. And a nursing mother who's eating a lot of trans fat will have low fat content in her milk, which will make nursing very difficult. And even though she's breastfeeding her baby, the baby will not do well because of the low fat content in her milk. Finally, our government has admitted that trans fats are a problem. And what do they say? Yes, we've now learned that trans fats are just as bad as saturated fats. So we made this little chart to show you that the saturated fats have the opposite effect of the trans. The trans have bad effects and the saturated fats have good effects. Couple of examples. Trans fats encourage inflammation, whereas the saturated fats suppress inflammation. The trans fats depress the immune system, whereas the saturated fats enhance the immune system. The first scientist to warn the public about the dangers of trans fats was my co-author, Mary Enig. That was back in 1978. So it's taken 30 years for her to be vindicated. Will it take another 30 years before we finally learn that saturated fats are okay? I hope it doesn't take that long. Well, this in a nutshell is what's wrong with the Western diet. Here we have 2 or 3 feet of shelf space devoted to butter and all the rest devoted to these margarines and spreads, which we're supposed to be eating. And I actually don't encounter people today who eat margarine. Oh, we never eat margarine. We eat the healthy spreads. So I thought I would do a little experiment. And I put a stick of butter on a plate outside, and I dumped one of these healthy, low-trans spreads out there on a plate to see what would happen. And the first thing that happened was a crow came along. He knew where the real food was. And he took a bite of the butter. And I thought that what would happen is just over a period of several hours, the birds would eat the butter and leave the spread. But the next thing that happened was a squirrel came along. Now, I thought squirrels were vegetarians, but this squirrel picked up the stick of butter and ran off with it. And the spread just sat there. If you take margarine or one of these tub spreads and put it on a plate in your kitchen, it will get dusty. But it will not get moldy. These products do not support microscopic life. How can you expect them to support your life if they won't even support the life of the microorganisms? But you know, the spreads are just the tip of the iceberg. Where these trans fats are is in processed foods, in the cookies and the crackers and the baked goods, the pie crust, the ho-hos, in the toaster pastries, in the chips, you know. You know, a teenage boy can eat a bag of these chips in about 10 minutes. After his low-fat USDA-approved lunch at school, by the time school's over, he is starving. And he goes to the local corner store and buys a bag of chips. Now, this is the age when, as Garrison Keillor says, sex replaces Christmas as the thing you look forward to in life. Has anyone telling these young men that the chips they're eating may prevent them from ever having a normal sex life? Because the trans fats interfere with testosterone production. If every boy in this country was taught that, this industry would go out of business. And the fries. Up until 1984, the fast food fries were done in lamb tallow. perfect fat for frying. Not bad for you and actually somewhat good for you. And they tasted great. Then in the early 1980s, a group that was subsidized by the soybean oil industry called Center for Science and the Public Interest went on a massive campaign to get rid of all these terrible saturated fats in the food supply. And overnight, all of this industry switched to the vegetable oils. And, I'm not a big advocate of fried foods, but I'm also a realist. I have four grown children. I know the teenagers are going to eat French fries. Unfortunately, today when they're eating French fries, they're eating cancer sticks. And that wasn't true before they switched. So here we are in the Quickie Mart. Don't you sell anything without the dreaded trans fatty acids? He says, sure, we sell cigarettes. There's a crying need for healthy fast food in this nation. You can't expect everyone to cook every meal. And these photographs were taken in New Zealand. This is a privately owned fish and chips shop. And here's some great fast food here. All this delicious seafood and even some sacred foods like shrimp and oysters. Now, I know that it's fried, dipped in batter and fried, but, at least that's a way of eating seafood for many people. And I don't know about you, I just cannot eat raw oysters, but I sure can eat a fried oyster. That's pretty good. But here on the back wall was a little sign. It says, just for you, we cook in cholesterol-free vegetable oil from Peerless. So I asked if the owner was there, and he was there. He owned the shop. He was there every day. And I said, I'm from America, and I was just interested in your sign here. I said, how long have you been using the Peerless vegetable oil? He said, a couple of years. I said, well, what did you use before? He said, well, it was called 90-10. 90-10 was actually a blend of 90% tallow and 10% other things. White, stable, really good oil for cooking. And I said, well, why did you switch? Well, he said, I had a couple of customers who were complaining that we had all this saturated fat in the food. And he said, I really like my customers. Some of these customers have been coming here for years, and I want my food to be healthy. And the vegetable oil man, the Peerless people, explained how healthy the vegetable oil was and that it didn't have cholesterol in it, didn't have saturated fat in it. And that's why I switched, because I wanted my customers to be healthy. I said, well, how do you like the vegetable oil? He said, I don't like it very much. I said, why not? He said, well, the food it doesn't taste as good. It's greasier. It doesn't smell as good. I have to change the oil more often, and it's more expensive for me also. And I could have added, it's also imported. If they've got anything in New Zealand, they've got tallow, with all those millions of sheep and cows. And so there's something wrong here. See, on this phony cholesterol theory, they are importing partially hydrogenated vegetable oil from America into New Zealand. Now, I look forward to the day when the fast food hamburger place, and there's nothing as good as a good hamburger with some fries. And the fast food hamburger place is a co-op owned by the local farmers. And on the wall will be a sign that says, just for you, we cook our fries in tallow and lard from local grass-fed animals. Sometimes we call this seminar, Why Butter is Better. Here's why. So I've divided this into two groups, high levels in grass-fed butter. We talked about the activators, A, D, and K. We haven't talked about vitamin E very much. Vitamin E is critical for reproduction. Minerals will be much higher in the grass-fed butter, and there's some really important minerals in butter. Copper, zinc, chromium, selenium, and iodine. Lots of iodine in butter. It's an excellent source of iodine. And the combination of iodine and vitamin A make butter a great food for the thyroid gland. And then conjugated linoleic acid, which is an anti-cancer substance in grass-fed butter. But all butter has other good things, short-chain fatty acids, a good balance of essential fatty acids, lecithin, which is a substance that helps you use cholesterol properly, glycosphingolipids, which help with digestion, and something called the Wolzin factor, which is an anti-stiffness factor, which helps with arthritis. This is the only component in butter that's destroyed by pasteurization. So when you're choosing butter, the most important thing is it comes from grass-fed animals. I mean, the nutrition of grass-fed butter will be vastly superior to butter from confinement animals. But even regular butter is a healthy food compared to the alternatives. Since the early 1900s, we've had this huge increase in cancer and heart disease. We don't know all the reasons for this increase, although I greatly suspect that the oils have a lot to do with it. At the same time, we've had a big decline in the consumption of butter. So whatever is causing these things, it certainly isn't butter. They're going in the opposite direction. Dr. Price did a fascinating study where he looked at samples of local butter all over the northern hemisphere and compared the levels of fat-soluble activators with deaths from pneumonia and heart disease in local hospitals. And he found an inverse relationship everywhere he looked. In other words, when the activators were high, the deaths went down. And when the activators came down, the deaths went up. And he found this pattern all over the country, even in Canada. So his theory about heart disease was that it was caused by a lack of the fat-soluble activators in foods like butter. We refer to this as the oiling of America. What's happened to the food supply in the last 100 years, a great decline in the consumption of animal food, animal fats like butter and lard, huge increase in shortening. And shortening in 1900 was made out of coconut oil and lard. It was not a processed fat, whereas today it's partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, the use of margarine, and look at the vegetable oils, a 16-fold increase in the use of the liquid oils. I like to end this section on fats and oils by talking about my friend Bill Smith. Bill is not into health foods at all, but he figured out that he feels good on a high-fat diet and without a lot of carbohydrates in his diet. Now, he does make a couple of exceptions on the carbohydrates. He makes an exception for M&Ms. And he also makes an exception for bourbon. So when you go to his house, there's these bowls of M&Ms all over the place, and he offers you a bourbon. But basically, his diet, with these two exceptions, is butter, cream, bacon, cheese, eggs, and some seafood. And he eats about 1 pound of butter a day, and he drinks about 1 quart of cream a day, and he buys his cream at Costco and his butter at Costco. So this is the worst quality butter. Now, I happened to run into Bill the other day, and he looked terrific. I said, Bill, I have to ask how old you are. And he said, I'm 90 years old. He looked like he was about 60. He's still gardening. He's still involved in community activities. He actually repaves his driveway every few years. He's still doing that. But he just looked fantastic. I couldn't get over it. The point I'm trying to make here is try not to be obsessive about your food. Do the best you can with your quality. And the sicker you are, the more attention that you're going to have to pay to your quality. But someone like Bill Smith, who got a good start in life and who really eats a lot of fat, he's getting along fine with not very good quality cream and butter. So there's still some goodness left in these foods. So if you don't remember anything else from our lessons on fat and oils, just remember that the good fats are mostly the animal fats, butter, beef tallow, lamb tallow, lard, and chicken, goose, and duck fat. Wonderful fats, full of vitamins. Then in the plant kingdom, we have the olive oil. Sesame oil is okay. A small amount of flax oil, and then your tropical oils. And then your fish liver oils, not fish oils. They're pretty worthless. And by the way, most of the fish oils are made from farm fish. But the fish liver oils, so you get your vitamins A and D. And then the bad fats are all the partially hydrogenated fats, including margarine and shortening, and the industrially processed vegetable oils. But any fat, especially the polyunsaturated oils, heated to very high temperatures. If you do want to have some fried food, use the animal fats and don't keep reusing that fat. Use it once or twice and then give it to the birds. They'll enjoy that. Okay, number 3. Make sure your diet contains sufficient high-quality animal products, some of which should be raw, And by high quality, we talk about whole dairy products from pastured cows, preferably raw, eggs from pastured chickens, meats, and particularly organ meats from pastured animals, fish eggs, fish and shellfish, and your cod liver oil. And truly, if you're getting high quality and eating the fats and getting your fat-soluble activators, you don't have to have a lot of animal foods in your diet. You do need to have some. Remember the activators. I can't stress enough that this is the crux of our message. We are not eating grass-fed animals to get omega-3 fatty acids. We're not eating them because they're lean. We want them to be fat. We're eating them to get vitamin A, which will be there if the animals are eating green grass, and vitamin D, which will be there if the animals are in the sunlight. Here is a wonderful animal food. This is salmon roe, salmon caviar. When this is in season, we get an ounce or so every week. It's kind of a poor man's caviar. Still pretty expensive, but worth it. This is a wonderful nutrient-dense food. I put it on some toast with butter. This is the pastured poultry model with the animals outside on green grass, getting lots of bugs and sunlight. Cows should be on pasture. The cow is an incredible machine for turning grass into nutritious milk and meat and organ meats for human beings. And we honor the cow as a sacred animal. The cow eating green grass spends her whole life turning green grass, which is inedible for humans, into vitamin A for us. And when we eat the liver and the organ meats and the meat and the milk and the butter from the cow, we want to be very grateful for what the cow is doing for us. The cow is a step-up transformer. Actually, all animals perform that function for us. They are a step-up transformer. They take foods that are difficult for or impossible for us to digest and turn them into foods that are much more easy for us to digest. This is what we're trying to get away from, the industrial model with all of the birds confined in darkness, or not so much darkness, but in one place. It's all automated except someone has to come in every day and pick up the dead birds. This is not only cruel to the animals, it's cruel to us because we will suffer from health problems if we're not getting the food of animals raised appropriately. And of course, the terrible conditions of these confinement operations. And this, by the way, is organic. This is the organic model. This is cage-free, free range. They're not in cages. It's not this. And it's certainly better, but it's not out in the open. So this is the organic model. And there's a big difference. Here's an egg raised on pasture, much richer in the fat-soluble activators. You can tell by the color. Second best would be the organic, and this is the typical supermarket egg. And they probably are feeding them something to make the yolks turn yellow. Egg yolks are a potent source of vitamin D if the chickens are outside in the bright sunlight. This was discovered in 1929. And I made some butter with cream I bought at the supermarket, and that's the color. That's a sign that there's very little vitamin A in the butter, whereas the beautiful yellow grass-fed butter, that's the type that we want, especially if you're trying to recover from a health problem, which most of us are. Livers, big difference. This is a pasture-raised liver. This is an organic liver. This is a liver from a conventional chicken. There's no integrity to it. It's pretty awful, okay? But this is so dark it looks like beef liver. So there's a difference. There really is a difference. Ready, steady, grow. That's what modern agriculture is all about. Getting those animals as big as you can, as fast as you can, slaughter them before there's any overt sign of disease, and put them out to the public. There's no reason to make the food healthy in the industrial system. So a lot of money is spent convincing you that there's no difference between industrially raised food and pasture-raised food. We're going to take our break now. Thank you very much. Thank you.